We have a very good friend of mine, Dalle Abraham. Dalle is a writer and researcher from Marsabit County, and his nonfiction essays have been published in Chimurenga Chronic, Kwani, Adda Stories, Down River Road and Errant journal. Dalle, going back to government quarters, could you give us a quick synopsis of your piece and a quick reading?
Thank you, Mami. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Dalle Abraham. I am from Marsabit. I've written about growing up in a government-provided staff quarters in the 90s, early 2000s. And I think when we moved to these government quarters, it looked like moving into some kind of privilege. But using Marsabit and privilege in the same sentence looks like an oversell, right? But then I think we bought into some kind of illusion of privilege. The idea that, say, for a long time, these staff quarters, government-provided quarters, had been places of privilege. If you read African novels, especially from the 60s and 70s, they are places where kids went to very good schools, jacarandas, of course. The cars that pick children from home and took them to school. But by the 90s, I think that dream had kind of fizzled out. We'd moved into these. A lot of people looking from the outside into the government quarters thought, oh, you know, those ones are like kind of exclusive society of sorts. A place where some kind of softer silence, polite innocence of certain kind was there. But even now, I feel many privileged spaces are very quiet places. But this quietness, I think, is a lack of people not saying enough. I think that silence is where some kind of violence, deep-lying violence lasts. So I think this is a kind of reflection and just thinking back about that. The expansive, eternally present and mystical forest beyond the road behind our house held an enchanting allure for us, boys coming of age. It served the role of a playfield, a private sanctuary, and a store of endless mysteries. Some days, elephants roamed between the houses. Some afternoon, as we played in front of the house, a pair of beautiful antelopes emerged, calmly grazing to our door fronts. Some nights you could see the glaring eyes of some animal in the bush across the ditch. During daytime, as the mystery lasted, we ran carelessly in the bowels of the forest, tarzaning from branch to branch. At night, the shadows were deep and baboon backs urgent. The baboons, as if in search of comfort, moved to the line of grevillea trees at the end of the third wooden cabin. You could smell their presence as you passed near those trees. The wood cabins brought both love and fear, and an in-betweenness of experiencing the nearby forest peacefulness and the chaos of the hospital wards. We soon learned that our house was referred to as condemned, a name that came to us in a slow, ebbing way, lapping on our own dreamscape, synonymous with a word that could itself be a prison. The rumors milling around condemned made our stay uncertain. It is up for demolition. It isn't fit for human habitation. It's not up to standard for government quarters. My parents plugged their ears to these cries but couldn't escape the uncertain night. The neighborhood transformed before my eyes into a chessboard as I made comparisons between our cabin and the other houses. The place was a bounded space of class orientation with physical and socially established hierarchies. These were apportioned in the number of rooms per house, or whether the houses were part of a line, or whether they were standalone, or whether they had their own compounds. One could see starkly the order of households as demarcated by its own hierarchies in its trash dump. Weetabix packets, Zesta and Blueband containers, and Quencher bottles spoke the unsaid. And yet the condemned wooden cabins were leagues ahead of houses in other government quarters, like, say, the prison quarters where my schoolmate, Ben, and his 3 beautiful older sisters lived. Their 1-bedroom dwelling had not been designed for a family, but for a transient bachelor. Yes, they believed they were better off because their neighbors lived in crumbling mud and wattle 1-room houses. The prison had been established in 1930, when our town had not yet celebrated its 20th year. Its quarters hadn't changed much in the 60-odd years it had sheltered the prison wardens. In all the neighborhoods, the bosses weren't a distant or invisible force. They walked along the same roads, but they were taciturn, as if privilege was always meant to be a world apart. They locked their doors and stayed indoors. When they were seen coming from the far end, we stopped our games. Some women walked back into their houses. Everyone shared the same worries and were equally affected by the tanking economy and were subject of the same experiments. In our house, every evening, there was a renewed silence and a fear you couldn't exactly put a finger on, sprawled carelessly on our coffee table. The endless evolution of the public and private lives were transmuted to us children by the subtle silences of our parents. Even in a remote and provincial town like Marsabit, International Monetary Fund, experimental policies such as the structural adjustment programs met real-life survival concerns. Whatever was going on in the corridors of power in Nairobi, a capital which was a 2-day lorry ride away on an untarmac road, played out in the shape of the shadows or the textures of the silences in the neighborhood. Today you could be living in the staff quarters, tomorrow you'll be packing your bags going for early retirement. A euphemism for being retrenched, the golden handshake.
Amazing. That part right there that you just concluded with, it's one of my favorite parts in the story when you write how those IMF experimental policies, such as the structural adjustment programs, when they met real-life survival concerns and how whatever was going on in the corridors of power here in Nairobi played out in the shape of the shadows or the textures of silences and anxieties in the remote provincial town of Marsabit. Could you just expand a bit and elaborate on how these macroeconomic policies translated into tangible anxieties and challenges at both the individual and the community level?
Quite a complex question. I hope I'll answer it. So
You got this.
I think, so the silences and the whispers were things that you thought was a baked-in idea of these kind of neighborhoods. But then you grow up, you read books like, say, Yvonne Adhiambo mentioning silences as a third language in this country, but it doesn't still kind of resonate deeply with you. You think this is supposed to be the silence of the state, for example, for what it does to people, to communities, to regions. But then the most important of these silences are those ones which you see your parents kind of not saying things or whispering certain things. And it gets some kind of very immediate, visceral immediacy of sorts. I think writing this piece for me has been a study of what these silences have been and how they, from the state level down to the household level, how people engage with the larger politics within their own environments and how these policies also shape, how the household level relates with each other, what is said and what is left unsaid. Yeah.
And the other thing that you touched on is also the social stratification within those government quarters. In the quintessential Dalle wittiness, those of you who've read Dalle's works, you know what I'm talking about. You write how, those Weetabix packets and Zesta and Blue Band containers and Quencher bottles spoke the unsaid, right? So the question is, how do you see this class and social hierarchies playing out in today's Marsabit, post-devolution Marsabit?
I think some certain kind of illusion has fallen in Kenya, and very interesting things are happening in the old villages that we used to kind of look down upon. Those are the spaces that are thriving, becoming very important cultural markers where good music comes from, where people are more freer, sleep easily, laugh genuinely, than say the quarters that we moved into, where hierarchies of sorts were there. Like when that's your dad's boss, and he lives in his own compound, and you guys are living in a line of houses. But also thinking about how these kind of hierarchies are embedded in the regions and landscapes. Like when you travel across this country, even now, those residential areas, government-provided spaces are still there. And you see them as places where, like the roof, the iron sheets are completely rusted, now there are appendages of certain kinds, iron sheet appendages to those houses. I mean, they've been taken over, guys, some have refused to move out of them. We've seen how the police officers live in this country, prison quarters. I think it's some kind of shame now that is often shown on TVs, where government residential quarters are not the thing they used to be in, say, in the 70s or 60s. I think now it's more a marker of poverty more than of privilege to be in such quarters. Yeah, yeah. And I don't mean this in a way to disparage the way people are living. Still means so much that I think those houses are still not available for so many people. But I think it's an illusion that that has fallen. Yeah.
Yeah. When we spoke last night about your story, there's something interesting that a story that you mentioned that, and I want you to share this with the audience. There's right now when you're reading it, you mentioned, your house, the house that your mom and your dad moved into, being referred to as a condemned house, and it was marked to be demolished or something. And from that the word condemned, that's how this whole story came up.
So every story has a story. The story of this story basically begins like this. I'm at a car wash in Marsabit, Jabba place. Guys are just milling around on a bigger story, right? So this guy tells me his experience of being jailed at committee. And he mentions H block, condemned, where the condemned are imprisoned. And when he said condemned, that word instantly kind of teleported me back to a neighborhood that I had completely kind of shut off. I'd forgotten about it. We'd moved out for a long time. But then I remembered the first time I had condemned was basically a reference to the kind of houses we were living in. And so immediately I kind of stopped everything and started writing this story, right? It's just titled Condemned, Dead, and then I started writing the things that stood out for me then. And then I visited these quarters. Surprise, surprise. The condemned quarters are still there.
Still standing.
Yeah, so I think there was also like other politics to it. When they say this is up for demolition, it was a kind of creating some kind of disturbance in one's head so that if you move out, someone else takes it up. So I don't know whether it was really condemned. I mean, even now, 20 plus years, the place is still there. The house still there, more crumbling, more decaying, a lot of decline. But then the wood used to be oil soaked and it used to be black. There were all these jacaranda trees, very tall grevillea trees. Now it's even more colorful. I mean, someone's painted it different colors. So that's the story of how I went back. And sadly for me, there are people who, when I was there, now slightly like guys in their middle age who are still within those quarters. And I think it's much more a story of entrapment. I think people getting stuck in some kind of illusion of privilege, and the silences still reign, right? Yeah.